Hi, I'm Bill Lindstaedt. I'm the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Career Advancement, International, and Postdoctoral Services at UC San Francisco. And this is part two in a workshop series on how to find an industry scientist position. And we're focusing in this session on how to write resumes for industry jobs, and then how to take that resume that you have and start applying for jobs in a way that's going to get you interviews. First, it seems like it's useful for people approaching the job market to understand how your documents flow through a company when you apply for jobs. And the first thing is, you'll see a job that you want to apply for, and you'll submit an application online typically. And the first person that sees that is normally a human resources screener, so probably not a scientist, and perhaps not even someone who understands all the language associated with your field or subfield. And yet that person is going to take a really short amount of time, whether it's through keyword search or a combination of keyword search and actually reading what's on your resume. And they're going to decide whether your resume is a pretty good fit for that job or not a good fit at all. If it's a pretty good fit, that screener will forward your resume on to the scientist who would be your boss. We'll call that person the hiring manager. And that person's going to spend a little bit more time skimming through your resume and seeing if you have what it takes for that position. And then probably in consultation with the human resource department, they'll decide on who gets an interview. And typically that's going to be a phone interview. We'll talk about how to succeed in your interviews in the next session in this series. But there'll be a brief phone interview. There might be additional phone interviews with either the human resource people or the scientist folks. And then they'll decide whether to invite you for an on-site interview, which would be a half day or a full day, including with a science talk or a job talk, et cetera. Based on your performance in those interviews, they'll decide on whether to move you on to the offer stage. So that sounds like a long process, but usually once they start interviewing you, it could go really quickly, like a few weeks or less. Often though, it takes a long time for the company to get you to that stage. So you might have applied for a job for 2 or 3 months earlier, and you haven't heard anything back from them, and then suddenly they call you on the phone and want to talk, and they'll move quickly after that point. So important to remember that just because you haven't heard from them for a while doesn't mean they're not interested. Give it a few weeks or even a few months. So what application materials do you need in order to get ready for the industry research scientist job market? You may have talked to your PIs or other people who have been on search committees or gone through the search process for faculty jobs, and you hear them talk about 2-page cover letters and multi-page CVs and teaching statements and research statements and 3 letters of reference and all these different documents that have to be put together for a faculty application. For industry research application, you really just need a resume and a cover letter. And our suggestion is, as you're preparing for the job search process, put together a generic resume that maybe has everything in it that you will eventually sort of cut pieces out of as you're applying for certain jobs and you're tailoring your job for your application for that particular position. So you'll have this generic resume, and then every time you apply for a job, you'll tailor it specifically to that job, and then a cover letter that you'll also tailor for position. What many people tell us, though, is that the cover letter is much less important than the resume in order to get you that first job. And then a lot of times we also get questions about the difference between a CV or a curriculum vitae versus an industry scientist resume. And most of you have probably prepared CVs for different conferences or applications for fellowships, et cetera. This can be a document that's unlimited in length, and curriculum vitae in Latin means the course of one's life. So it's basically everything you've ever done. For an industry resume, it should be 1 to 2 pages, sometimes 3 pages with publications. And the feedback you get if you go out searching for job search advice online generally says resumes should be 1 page. And that seems to be like a generally accepted rule. That doesn't seem to be the rule for industry scientist positions. It's hard to say everything, to describe everything you've done and to list your publication history and your skill set and all these different parts of a good industry resume in 1 page. So okay if you go on to a couple pages, especially when you include your publications. Another thing about CVs being a complete history is that that's expected, that there will be extraneous information in a CV that may not be related to a faculty job that you're applying for, a postdoc job. For industry research scientists, the information you include should be there for a purpose. So it'll turn out to be a selected history for about yourself that's selected so that you are telling a story about your background that fits that job description. Most good industry resumes start with a profile or a highlights section. We'll say a lot more about that shortly. And then, like we said, it'll be tailored every time you apply for a position. You should have headings that in your resume that as the reader skims down the resume, they can easily decide whether there's a section that they want to read or not. And then, as we mentioned, cover letters. A lot of industry research scientists who do hiring, or the hiring managers, HR people, tell us that the cover letter may play a big role later down the process, but at this point in the industry interview process, or industry application process, your resume is just designed to help get the message out there that you're qualified for this particular job. And then finally, many times, people in academic settings include references in their cover letter. They mention them as well as their CV sometimes. In an industry resume, our advice is to omit the references. You do not need to mention your references. And sometimes people ask the question, what happens if my PI doesn't know I'm job hunting? That's okay. References may be asked later in the process, so after you do your interviews, they may call and say, can you send us a list of your references? And at that point, you can bring up the discussion about, my current boss doesn't know I'm job hunting, so I've included the names of other people who can address my performance. And that'll be okay in an industry setting. So what goes into a resume then? Typically, you'll have your heading at the top and then this profile or summary or highlight section that essentially makes it just easy for that human resource person to see that you fit very closely with the content of the job description. Because most resume screeners are looking for a few qualification points at the beginning. So do you have a PhD? Is it in the right field? That's why your education section should probably go up very high in the resume, where it's one of the first things they see. And then we see lots of resumes where it says professional experience, and it's a big list of everything you've ever done, every job you've ever had. And our suggestion is make it easy for the reader to understand what they're going to be reading about by breaking up those experience sections. So research experience, teaching experience, if you've had, been a lab manager, put a leadership and supervision section. If you've been in industry even for a 3-month internship, have an industry experience section. So break it up so that the reader can really see these different sections easily. Most of the trainees we see moving from academic to industry settings are applying for jobs that highly value the skills or techniques that they bring to the field, or to the position. And so it's probably useful to have a section that just says skills or techniques, and then a big laundry list of all the things you can do in some sort of a subcategorized section underneath that heading. If you have awards and it's not obvious from that award what it's for, make sure you explain. So we see lots of awards where it's just a person's name who provided the money behind that award, and the Bob Smith Award. And that doesn't mean anything to the reader. So say Bob Smith Award for outstanding graduate student in my PhD program, something like that. And then usually presentations or publications go at the end of the document, and most of the industry scientists that we've talked to say that you don't need to put every presentation that you've ever done. Maybe just list the invited presentations at major conferences if you have something like that. But because when you're applying for an industry scientist position, your publication history is the indicator of your productivity, our suggestion is to put all of the publications that you have, even if they're in fields that aren't appreciated by the job that you're applying for. So you might have a subheading that has, biochemistry-related publications, and then another one that has, pharmacogenomics publications if you've been in a couple different fields. And the reader can then decide which ones they want to read, but they'll want to see that you've published as much as you possibly can indicate to them. So a few ideas about how to tailor your resume for a particular job. And this might be the most important slide in the slide deck, which is try to think like the screener. And that's the best way to sort of tailor this document. So you'll start with the generic resume, the general resume that you created that we talked about earlier. And then go to the job description and read it very carefully and put yourself in the place of the screener and say, if I were the person who had 100 resumes to read through, what criteria must I see on the candidate's resume in order for that person to move on in the process to the hiring manager? And then take that list and go back to your profile section, which we'll explain in a moment, and tailor your profile, edit the profile section so that it fits the screening criteria as closely as possible. And then read your profile section again and say, what have I said about myself in this general profile description that I need to support in the rest of my resume? And then go back through your research experience or your skills or your sections or how you're presenting your publications. Maybe you need to add some extra sections that talk about your people skills or how you've done leadership experiences in the past to sort of support everything you've made a claim about yourself in the profile section. So we'll talk about this profile section. It's usually the first part of your resume that the person reads from top to bottom. And I think, as we mentioned before, there's really two purposes. One is to demonstrate to the human resource screener that you have everything is required, as much as required for that job as possible. And sometimes it almost becomes a plagiarism of the job description into your profile section. I'll give you some examples here shortly. But the other purpose is to provide a hook so that the hiring manager, when they get your resume, the scientist wants to read more. So, she said she can do these things. We really need those in this future job. Let me read where she developed that. Oh, she did this project when she was, in her PhD work, or she collaborated on this topic when she was a postdoc. And they can start to see how you're making a claim about yourself and how you're supporting that. Usual format for a profile section is a 1 or 2 line statement that categorizes you and subcategorizes you in the language of the job description. And then some bullets under that sort of map your background directly to the job description. A profile section that we read that was sort of the introductory section was, clinical pharmacologist with postdoctoral PK/PD background and experience with regulatory guidelines and applications. And some of that language might be lifted directly from the job description, and so that screener says, wow, this person is really highly qualified for this job. So let's take a look at what it might look like if you tried to tailor a profile section or a summary section for your resume to a particular job description. So let's say you wanted to apply for this protein chemist position. The job ad will give you lots of signals about what you might want to include. So obviously they're looking for someone who has a PhD level degree in biochemistry. It would be great if someone has experience in industry or a combination of industry and academic experience, for example. They'll give you some hints about sort of sub-backgrounds, so protein chemistry background, structural biology, protein chemistry, and then some specific backgrounds, things like NMR, X-ray crystallography, protein purification, techniques or backgrounds that you might have to bring to that. And then most job descriptions that you read for industry scientist positions draw attention also to these things that recruiters call soft skills. So your management skills, your communication or writing skills, teamwork types of skills. Those are really hard things to write credibly about in a profile section or anywhere in your resume. And so if you don't bring a lot of those things to the job search process, that doesn't mean you won't get an interview for the job, because at this point, early in the process, you're just applying for the job. They're going to be focused on, can you do the job? Do you have the skill set and the technique background and the research experience or knowledge background that will allow you to do this position? They'll dig into those soft skills later as you get into the interview process. But at this point, you can get the interview just based on your ability to do the job itself. So here's a sample of an example of a profile section that might have been written just for that particular job description. So I'm a protein chemist. I have more than 5 years of combined experience in industry and academia. I have extensive background in these two fields that you need me to bridge, chemistry, structural biology. I've done protein purification. I've done MR, NMR, and crystallography. Maybe I'm going to say more about that later in my, down further in my resume. And then, this person did point out their soft skills. I have excellent communication, teamwork, and writing skills, but anybody can say that, right? They helped it out by saying, I've developed those through my previous industry position and some management duties I had at the bench, for example, and that makes you kind of want to read more about how that person got that background. So if you're going to write about your soft skills in your resume, support it by saying developed through whatever it was that brought you to that point. So there's a lot of information on the UCSF Career Office's website. So if you just go to career.ucsf.edu, click on PhDs, non-academic careers, and then CVs, resumes, and cover letters, you'll see a whole bunch of steps, a whole bunch of samples, as well as step-by-step instructions for how to do this tailoring process that's so important. And just to give you a quick view, if you go to this website and click on the tutorial for how to tailor your resume, we help you find, take apart a job description, so how to read job descriptions for industry research positions and how to get what signals they're giving you about what you should be describing about yourself. And then there's a section on how to write a cover letter that's tailored to that job description, and then a section on how to craft a resume that's tailored to that job description. And our career advisors have taken this apart section by section and given tips on how to create a tailored document. So we'll move on to what happens when you have created this ideal resume and you're ready to start applying for jobs. Sort of what works. And the trap that we think you want to avoid is spending too much time on job hunting sites and not enough time getting out there and talking to people. And some of the job hunting sites which are very useful, Biospace, Monster.com, Indeed, all the places that you can find that post jobs, they're great, but they get more money when they get more traffic and when that traffic stays longer on their websites. So I spent 2 hours applying for jobs on Biospace. I got 4 jobs, and now I'm CEO of the company, is kind of a message they want to send. And we actually have cut and pasted from, not Biospace, a different website that sort of said that this job seeker, Mike, said, I applied for a very few jobs. I got half of those were interviews, and I got multiple job offers, and it was all done really quick on this website. Our suggestion is that our observation is about 20 to 25% of people moving from academic research positions to industry research positions get their jobs this way. Almost everybody gets their job by talking to people and making contacts that are going to tell you about jobs. And these are the people who need to be, in your field, in your background, who are going to bring you along and tell you about these positions. The last workshop, part 1 of this series, had lots of information about how to identify those people. But this is where you want to really start making that network work. And so we'll talk about how to get job interviews through your application process by networking, working with third-party recruiters. And then you do want to apply for online jobs, on these websites. But we'll talk about how to do that in the most successful way possible. So, briefly, we talked a lot about building a network and informational interviewing in the first section of this series. But once you've sort of created a list of people, 6 months or a year prior, as you've built your network by doing all these informational interviews, this is where you want to go back now as you're saying, okay, it's time for me to get a job. I'm going to start applying. Re-engage those people that you talked with and let them know that you're applying for jobs. So go back and perhaps even conduct more informational interviews with the same people, and where you're going on to a more direct topic about what advice they have for you for the application process, or continue meeting new people and additional people who will be able to help you as you build this network, and they'll tell you about job opportunities. A couple of resources that some people don't think about doing is, I'm going to go to a meeting. Suppose you go to a meeting every year or two. I'm going to go to a conference. Let me invite someone at that meeting to talk with me, or invite them to my poster or talk, or just have coffee with them. And I'm going to go through the proceedings of the meeting, a week or 2 weeks before I go, and I'm going to pick out people who are at companies, and I'm going to ask them if they'll meet with me. And you can make that a direct invite, like we talked about in the first seminar, but invite a few people to meet with you, and then have coffee with some industry scientists and have that face-to-face meeting. It could be a really efficient way of meeting people who will help you, and we've talked to a number of trainees who have actually gotten job leads that way. So a good place to reach out to industry contacts. And then another resource that might help you understand how to move the informational interview process to more direct, how do I start asking about jobs, would be these articles that are on the slides and the slide deck from Dave Jensen, a really great advisor on science jobs. And there's 2 articles on networking, and one that's about sort of how you ask people about jobs. And all of those are really useful, great advice. They look like they're outdated, but they're very current in terms of their advice and how useful that is. We also mentioned briefly working with third-party recruiters. So these are people who are called headhunters sometimes, or search firms. They're basically consultants that are hired to find difficult-to-find people. So if Amgen wants to hire a person with a PK/PD background, and they're not getting the applications they wanted in through their online site, they might hire an outside firm to help them source more candidates. The search firms are paid by the employer, not the job seeker. We advise that you don't pay third parties to help you find a job. You can do all of this work yourself and not have to pay people. But typically, if you want recruiters to be calling you, the best things to do are be visible, go to meetings, publish papers, develop a list of headhunters, and actually just get a resume out to all of them for their database. After you send a resume to them, your generic form of your resume, because you may not see that they're posting jobs, you just want them to know about you. Give a phone call, let them know that you're job seeking. They'll say, we put you in our database. If we have something, we'll call. So just get your resume out there and see what happens. Maybe you'll update it every couple months just to keep yourself fresh in their database. And how to find these people is, there are really specialized search firms that work in every subfield of industry research. So if you just Google immunology search firm, you'll find a few that work specially in that field. And it could be just a Saturday afternoon project. Get your list together, get your resume out to all those people, follow up if you can on the phone and find out how they work and what they've done with your resume, and then wait and see if they call you. There are also contract agencies that work in science, and they often hire more people at the master's or bachelor's level, the tech level or research associate level, but sometimes they do have contract work for PhD level scientists. So firms like Kelly Scientific Lab Support, the list that's on the slide deck, you should get your resume out to these folks as well, and sometimes they'll call you and they'll say, we have a position for someone who matches your skill set. It's a 1-year or a 6-month role. While someone else is gone, after that position, after that person comes back, the job will no longer exist. Are you interested? And that's a point where you have to decide, is this a good time for me to leave and move to, Genentech, where I will be basically a temporary employee working for this contractor, but I get experience on my resume at a big biotech company. Maybe that's useful. So this is something that's you have to think about in the moment, I guess. But some people have started very useful careers through contract agencies. And then finally, if you want headhunters or recruiters to notice you and call you, get your resume out where these search firms look. So make sure your LinkedIn profile is spruced up and it says that you're job hunting, that you're on the market. Make sure that your resume is posted on the BioSpace or Monster, Indeed, all these websites that allow you to post a resume and see what happens. So we mentioned that many people do get jobs through applying to positions just through online job postings. But we have a few tips that might help you make that the most effective process possible. What you should do if you're applying for jobs online is find that position that you want to apply for. Do as much research to learn as much as you can about that position. Sit down, think like the human resources recruiter, the screener like we talked about. Create that list of screening criteria that you think they'll be using. Tailor your resume to that position. So create that nicely targeted resume and cover letter, and then submit all that online like you're supposed to. But then send another second application, we call it, for that position to a scientist within the company. So the goal is get your resume in through the human resource people, but also get your resume circulating through the company through the scientist network as well. So how do you do that? Well, you might start with someone that you've done an informational interview before with in that company. That might be the person you tailor this target your second application to. You might send it to a scientist who you think might be in the department based on what they've published and what you know about that position already. Or you might have to cold email it to just any scientist in the company. But the letter might look something like this. A subject line for the email might say, inquiry about protein chemist position. And then an email with your PDF resume attached might just say, I've been reading with interest about the scientific developments at your company, and I'm writing to you because we share a background in a particular field, or we met at this conference, or we had an informational interview 2 months ago, so I'm following up with you. I recently noticed a job posting on the Abgenix website for this protein chemistry position that I think I'm really well qualified for. And then you tell them, I've already applied online to the human resource website, so I don't want you to necessarily send my resume on to HR. Instead, would you be willing to forward my resume on to the hiring scientist who's in charge of this position? Or if you're that person, I hope you'll read my resume attached and consider contacting me for an interview. So sometimes this feels really forward. The feedback we get is, I feel like I'm bothering this scientist who's not in charge of hiring for this position, perhaps. But what the human resource people and the scientists often tell us is, the savvy job seeker uses this approach because everyone knows that the scientists are the best references for other scientists, because those are the people who kind of recognize your skill set and your background and can make the best determination for whether you're truly qualified for the position. So you really want to get your resume into both of those streams, HR and the scientist stream. People often ask, how long does it take for this process? How much time should I devote for my job search process? And as we look at the trainees who have moved successfully into the biotech industry from an academic setting, it often takes 6 months or even a year or even more if they trace back, when did I first start talking to people about jobs, and then when did I finally get my job offer? That can take months and months. So prepare ahead of time. Use the time that you're devoting each week in the best way possible. So remember, if you have 4 hours a week to look for your jobs, don't spend 3.5 of them on websites. Spend 3 of them or 3.5 of them out there talking to people, and then check your websites every week to see every month to see what's been posted. At any rate, stay with this process. It works. People move from academia to industry successfully all the time, and the goal of this workshop was to help you understand the most efficient, best way to go through that process. Thanks for listening.